The city was drenched in the oppressive weight of both heat and tension, the kind that settled over the streets like an unspoken challenge. Officer Mike Carter, a seasoned cop, had seen it all. He was no stranger to the undercurrent of crime that pulsed through the neighborhood. He had been working in this district for over a decade, long enough to see faces come and go, and long enough to form conclusions about the people who lived there. The truth was, Mike had grown bitter. The news stories, the rumors, the endless cycle of violence. He had become disillusioned, and that disillusionment turned into an unspoken distrust of the very people he was supposed to protect. Most of all, it turned into something darker: racism. That night, the streetlights flickered on as he cruised in his patrol car, eyes scanning the sidewalk. The neighborhood was quiet, unusually so. It was the kind of night when nothing should have happened. But then he saw him. A man walking alone, his posture suggesting fatigue, his gait steady but purposeful. Jeremiah Collins. Mike had seen him before, knew his face. A man who worked 2 jobs, trying to carve out a life for himself. But it didn't matter, not tonight. He wasn't here to see the individual, just another figure in the dark. Mike slowed his car and rolled down the window. "Hey, you!" Mike called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. Jeremiah stopped, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes locked with Mike's for a moment before he turned to face the officer fully. The tension was immediate. He had been pulled over by cops before, too many times, but tonight, something about Mike's presence made his stomach churn. "Where you headed?" Mike asked, stepping out of the car. "Home," Jeremiah said, his voice steady, but his nerves were beginning to fray. He knew the drill. This wasn't just a casual encounter. Mike took a few steps closer, studying Jeremiah from head to toe. "You sure about that?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "You look like you're up to something." Jeremiah took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "I just finished work, officer. I'm heading home." Mike's eyes flicked to the dark street behind him, then back at Jeremiah. He could feel the old biases rising, but tonight they were sharper, more pronounced. He had seen too many people like him, too many thugs that ended up doing something stupid. "I don't trust people like you walking around at this hour," Mike muttered, his hand hovering near his belt. Jeremiah's chest tightened. "What do you mean, people like me?" Mike stepped closer, not letting the distance grow between them. "You know what I mean." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The air around them felt heavier, thicker. Jeremiah's hands clenched by his sides, but he forced himself not to react. "Not yet. I'm not doing anything wrong," Jeremiah said, trying to stay composed. Mike took another step forward, the power imbalance palpable. "You're not the one to tell me what's wrong or right," Mike snapped, his voice rising. He grabbed Jeremiah's arm roughly. "You're under suspicion." "What?" Jeremiah exclaimed, pulling away. "This is ridiculous." Without another word, Mike twisted his arm, forcing him against the patrol car. His words were laced with a quiet venom. "You're gonna learn to respect me. You hear me?" Jeremiah's breath quickened. He knew what this was. He had seen it before, in the stories of others, in the headlines that only seemed to get worse. He didn't resist, didn't want to make it worse. But every part of him screamed that this was wrong. "Let me go, officer," he said, his voice softer now, desperate. "Shut up and get in the car," Mike barked, pushing him toward the back seat. Jeremiah, overwhelmed, stayed quiet. He had been arrested before, though never for anything he'd done wrong. His mind raced as they drove in silence. What would happen next? Would he be thrown in a cell with no explanation, or worse, beaten for doing nothing but existing in a neighborhood they deemed suspicious? Back at the station, the news spread fast. Word of the arrest hit social media and the local news outlets. Protests began forming the next day, and the community, Jeremiah's community, came together, demanding justice for the wrongful treatment of one of their own. Jeremiah's family was devastated. His mother, especially, couldn't understand how things had gone so far, how her son had been treated like a criminal when he was simply trying to get home. Carter, meanwhile, was dealing with a different kind of pressure. His colleagues nodded along in silence, pretending not to notice the awkwardness that followed him. His actions were justified, they told him. He was doing his job. But something gnawed at him deep inside, a feeling he couldn't shake. Days passed, but the protests didn't die down. Jeremiah's face was plastered everywhere, and the calls for change grew louder. Carter stayed holed up in his apartment, avoiding calls from his commanding officer. He tried to tell himself that it was all blown out of proportion, but each passing day chipped away at his convictions. He saw the pictures of Jeremiah's daughter, a little girl with wide eyes and a hopeful smile, asking why her father was in jail. He saw the faces of the protesters, angry, yes, but determined, too. There was one call he couldn't ignore. A mandatory mediation session with the police chief, a meeting designed to help heal the tension between the community and the department. Mike showed up, his face set in a rigid mask of authority, trying to hold on to his pride, but his heart was pounding. What was he supposed to say? What could he possibly say? Jeremiah arrived at the meeting, too, his face bruised from the altercation, but his spirit unbroken. They sat across from one another, the tension in the room thick with history. The police chief spoke first, trying to establish some order, but the moment Mike and Jeremiah locked eyes, everything went silent. There was no formal introduction, no attempt at small talk. Jeremiah spoke up first. "You don't know what it's like to walk around in my shoes. Every day, I tell my daughter to be careful, to make sure she's not doing anything that might make someone think she's a threat. I'm just trying to live, man, and you come at me like I'm the problem. Why?" Mike's grip tightened on his chair, his throat dry. "I was just doing my job, all right?" He didn't look at Jeremiah as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the table between them. "I thought you were up to something. People like you. You don't get to just walk around without people noticing." Jeremiah shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the problem. You see me, but you don't see me. You don't see the man who works 2 jobs. You don't see the father, the son. You just see my skin color, my past, the things you've been taught to believe." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything they had said before. Mike felt the weight of them, sinking deep into him. He couldn't deny it any longer. Everything he had told himself was wrong. He had been wrong. The silence between them felt different this time. Mike didn't know how to make it right, but something shifted in him. He had to change, or he'd never look at himself in the mirror again. Months passed, and the investigation into the incident moved forward. Mike faced consequences for his actions. There were internal reviews, and eventually the department demanded accountability. But change didn't come overnight. Not for him or for the community. Jeremiah, on the other hand, became an advocate for justice. He spoke at rallies, pushing for reform, using his voice for the voices of many who had been silenced before. He still carried the weight of his past, but he was learning how to let it fuel a future of hope. Then, one day, they crossed paths again. It wasn't a confrontation this time. Mike had been working on himself, seeking therapy, confronting his biases. He approached Jeremiah outside a community center where a meeting was being held. "I owe you an apology," Mike said, his voice quiet but genuine. Jeremiah looked at him, eyes weary but not hostile. "You don't owe me, officer. You owe every person who's been through what I've been through. But we can start somewhere, right?" The words hung between them, a fragile bridge across the gulf of past mistakes. Neither of them knew where the road would take them, but for the first time, they both saw the possibility of something better.